can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the sand. And right now, I feel like 100 grand.
You are listening to Inspired Insider with your host, Dr. Jeremy Wise.
Dr. Jeremy Weiss here, founder of InspiredInsider.com, where I talk with inspirational entrepreneurs and leaders. Today is no different. I have Paul Burani of Mission Flywheel. You can check him out at missionflywheel.com. Paul, before I formally introduce you, I always like to point out other episodes of the podcast people should check out. Since this is part of the Top Agency series, there's a couple interesting ones. I had Todd Taskey on. Todd Taskey helps pair agency owners with private equity. So he helps sell agencies. He has the Second Bite podcast because sometimes he's found that when the owners sell the private equity sells again. Sometimes those founders make more on the second bite than they do on the first. So it was a really interesting conversation about the agency space, the valuation, M&A space, and just business in general. Another one of the fan favorites, Paul, was Adit Clevitt. Adit Clevitt has an agency that basically is a done-for-you solution for SOPs. So she goes into a company, and if they need to smooth out their onboarding process or needs for staff or clients, she comes in and just documents the SOPs for them and puts it into a portal. We geeked out on our favorite productivity tools, software, and those kind of things. So check those out more on inspiredinsider.com. And this episode is brought to you by Rise 25. At Rise 25, we help businesses give to and connect to their dream relationships and partnerships. We do that in two ways. One, we help companies launch and run a podcast. We're an easy button for a company to do that. We do the strategy, the accountability, and then the full execution and production, kind of like the magic elves, Paul, that run around the background and make it look easy for the hosts. So create amazing content and amazing relationships and obviously, run their business. So number two, we're an easy button for a company's corporate gifting. So we make gifting and staying top of mind easy and simple and seamless. And for me, important is affordable, because if I'm sending it to clients or partners or staff, I want to make it all of those things. So people just give us a list of their addresses and we do everything else, from the gift selection to the card to the branding to which is their brand and everything else. So, for me, the number one thing in my life is relationships. I'm always looking at ways on how I can give to my best relationships. And over the past decade, I've found no better way than profiling people on my podcast and sending them follow-up gifts that mostly are food so they can enjoy it with the family too. So check it out, rise25.com, or email support@rise25.com. I am excited to introduce Paul Burani, he's founder and chief revenue officer at Mission Flywheel. I guess, Paul, people would describe you as a numbers person. You do digest large sums of data, picking it apart for insights, but then most importantly, kind of putting it back together to tell compelling stories. And really, Paul's used this approach for over 20 years to help clients optimize revenue growth. He's done it as a market researcher, an advertising agency founder, managing partner, a sales leader in a digital media company, which you may have heard of, called Google, and education and workforce development. Really since 2023, he's worked as a fractional CRO, consultant advisor to growth stage companies. So really what that means is he helps companies achieve capital efficient scale through a validated go-to-market strategy. And also works on innovation and a customer-centric culture, which you can obviously get from the name of his company called Mission Flywheel. So Paul, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Jeremy. It's a pleasure to talk to you. And we have at least one thing in common, just hearing about your product. I think both of us are pretty bought into this idea of the power of giving, right? Especially as a business owner, I find that it may seem counterintuitive to people, but sometimes when you give a lot in a weird way, it comes full circle and you get a lot too. And I found that to be especially true in this stage of my career.
Totally. One of my favorite books, I'm curious some of yours too. Brian Kurtz wrote Over Deliver. And so he's a friend, colleague, mentor. I would consider him all the above. And he talks about kind of 100-0, which is like just give as much as humanly possible and don't expect anything in return, it was kind of like a weird, hard concept sometimes for people. So I try and live by that. And, Adam Grant's book, Give and Take, right, talks about this and that givers are the least successful and also the most successful. So I encourage people to check that book out. Do you have any favorites in your Audible or Amazon that people should check out over the years?
Yeah, too many to list, but a few that are top of mind. A couple that I come back to, right? A good book is one that you want to come back to. I read a book about 15 years ago during my agency days called Made to Stick. And it's sort of like a manual for how to
It's one of my
communicate
favorites.
ideas.
I love
Oh,
it.
it's fantastic. How to make ideas sticky, right? And how good ideas that aren't sticky fall by the wayside. But if you follow a simple framework, it can make you, really memorable. But a more current book that has really compelled me to think in a new way is called Speed and Scale. It's written by John Doerr, one of the early venture investors in Google, and it's really a very pragmatic look at our climate crisis and creating a sort of a very analytical view of what are our priorities and what is the relativity of those priorities before getting into some very practical topics around how to take action.
I love that. I will have to check that. I'll have to put that one in my Audible for sure. I'm looking it up right now. Yeah, Speed and Scale, John Doerr. Because that did he also write another one, Measure What Matters? Or
Yes.
yeah, okay.
Yeah, Measure What Matters is another good one. It's all about the OKR framework for, strategic leadership and sort of top to bottom execution. Smart guy.
Yeah, and OKRs. Did Google implemented his OKR system too?
They did, but fun fact, OKRs were as the record would indicate, OKRs are actually the brainchild of oh my God, the name is escaping me. The founder of Intel. You're going to look it up.
Yeah,
Grove, Andy Grove.
Andy Grove. Yeah.
So Intel really like birthed the idea of OKRs and weaving it into the sort of modern corporate framework. Google is famous for it because Google took them and evolved them and brought them along at a time when company culture was going through, an interesting heyday. And one thing that I think Google applied to the OKR framework, which made it even more appealing, I think, was transparency at the very highest leadership level. So one of the coolest things about working at Google was that every quarter, every functional business leader around the company would get in front of the company and basically in an all hands meeting say, all right, here's our scorecard for me and for my business. Here's what I set out to do. Here's what we as a team achieved. I am accountable to these results. And wherever there's green, we high five ourselves. Wherever there's red and yellow, there's more work to be done. And they were very honest and transparent about it. But the really cool thing about it was if there was too much green, you actually were not celebrated as a hero. You were basically slapped on the wrist and said you didn't make ambitious enough OKRs. So see you next quarter.
Interesting.
Yeah,
We'll get into the Google days. I do want to talk about, Mission Flywheel and
sure.
what you do and what the company does. And as you do that, I'm going to pull up the website too. So talk about Mission Flywheel and what you do.
Yeah, so I was a founder a long time ago, went and had a corporate career, learned a thing or two along the way, but I always felt this kind of tractor beam pulling me back to entrepreneurship. And so after spending a number of years in media and advertising space, working with big clients that really were the best in the world at measuring human behavior and then making big investments based on those insights. I spent time in edtech and learned about how to apply, sales and marketing and revenue ideologies in a new context. And in Mission Flywheel, I'm basically trying to sort of open source that those sensibilities. And that means, working with clients, especially growth stage businesses, where there's a lot of building to be done, to build it right. Because I've seen how early stage companies can kind of run that lean startup methodology and be scrappy to succeed. I've seen how big companies achieve the momentum that keeps them moving forward. And so there's something to be learned at both extremes. But I like to work, Mission Flywheel is really about supporting these growth stage companies to kind of be the best they can be, lean into their mission, and achieve momentum in their revenue operation through a number of little tricks that I've picked up along the way.
I'd love to hear how you decided on the type of client you were going to serve. Obviously, you've worked with huge clients and you worked with Google, and also you are a mentor at Techstars as well. So you've mentored small clients. Who's like the ideal client sweet spot from, like, I don't know, however you want a company size.
Yeah.
It could be staff or revenue. I'm not sure who's ideal for you.
Yeah. The practical answer, Jeremy, is, I think most of my clients are companies like probably capped at about 100 employees. I like working with those companies, and there's a lot of diversity from 0 to 100, of course. But I like them because there's a lot to be built. There's more building than maintaining, and I just tend to be better as a builder. There is a pattern in terms of the types of clients that we attract. It's there's a lot of education, climate, healthcare, but I've got also, at the intersection of those industries, you have other business models as well. A lot of my clients, operate a sort of a SaaS business. A lot of them are B2B. Some of them, bleed into professional services. And the truth is, I look for the individual, that founder or C-level that has a certain mindset and has a certain need that I can maybe step in and deliver on. A lot more so than some of these firmographics, like an industry or a size, or they utilize a certain technology.
I'd love to get, inside Paul's head for a second on how you think about things, your methodologies. Maybe we could talk about ThingLink and what you
Sure.
did there, and some of the things that you talked about and implemented.
Yeah, ThingLink's a really cool company. One of the aforementioned, SaaS companies in the edtech space, and they've got a really cool product. Which effectively, what it does is it delivers immersive learning experiences through sort of a technology-enabled platform. Now, if we strip out the marketing speak, what does that mean? It means that if you were a student, you're going to learn about the Civil War. Traditionally, your teacher might say, turn to page 110 in your textbook, or here's a ditto or a handout, right? And now with ThingLink, what it means is, hey, log into this website and experience 360 video, put on VR glasses, and you are standing in the Battle of Gettysburg, and click on these hotspots to see what different soldiers
That's
and
cool.
generals have to say. So the evolution of that business was, for many years, they really dug into the education space, first working with teachers, then districts, and ultimately higher education. And at the time that I joined as a fractional CRO, really there was an acceleration and a pivot to, not so much a pivot, but an augmentation of the scope to also include corporate learning. So imagine, a manufacturing company that is bringing new employees into its facilities, into its factories every week. And, traditionally, these people might get a bunch of PDFs in their inbox, and it's all about how to navigate the factory floor. How do you operate this machinery without losing an arm? And so now we're sort
That's
of
an important
taking,
one.
it's an important one. You got to have one, ideally two arms to do good work in the factory, and so nobody wants to lose it. And in business speak, on the corporate side, it's also about compliance. It's about employee experience, right? So yeah, everyone should keep their arms, but also we're going to make you better at your job. We're going to make you a happier employee. We're going to streamline some of the operations that chew up resources in a business, right? Like dealing with regulators, and staying on top of the sort of table stakes for operating in a given industry. So safety training is a classic use case. It's one of many for ThingLink. But the role's been very interesting because, I've sort of weaved in and out of different business functions, everything from, developing revenue operations playbooks and kind of setting the tone for how the revenue organization would function, to almost like chief of staff, investor relations type work, doing some brand communications, supporting lead generation efforts, and bringing on team members, to sort of create end-to-end pipeline of inbound opportunities. So, the work is never done, but it's a fast-paced business, and I love the mission, right? I mean, they're just trying to make learning more of a pleasant experience, and to dispel the myth that it has to happen in a classroom.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you have a lot of different skill sets. I'm curious when you go into someone like ThingLink or anywhere, where do you start? What do you do first? Because there's so much you can tackle.
Well, I mean, I start with the problem at hand, right? And I want a clear articulation of the problem at hand. Eventually, I might give my own version of it. But I think that every business is really just in the business of solving problems. And if the founders and the C levels who bring me in need help articulating that problem, I can help. But really, it's not long before I start getting into the data. If the data exists and it needs packaging in order to be decipherable, that's one set of problems I've encountered. Sometimes the data is not sufficient. Sometimes we don't know about our customers, even if we've been in business a decade or longer. There are blind spots, right? And I look at those. Blind spots are always perceived as obstacles. Everyone has them, but I see them as opportunities to unlock insight. And it goes back to the very start of my career, as you pointed out, at the top of the conversation, right? Just picking apart data, finding those nuggets of insight, putting the story back together, kind of like Humpty Dumpty, right? And then delivering it and saying, we can go out and get some additional data points, understand our customer better, understand our competition, our market, whatever it may be. Data is a really good way to de-risk what is really a very uncertain world in 2025.
What's an example of that? Like, are they handing like, hey, Paul, here's our customer data. We need you to figure out, who our best customers are. Like, what are they asking you, and what are they handing to you?
Well, actually, I mean, since we're talking about ThingLink, there's a good example right there. What we wanted to do, since we were concurrently breaking into the enterprise segment and also looking to, as a European headquartered company, look to get more of a foothold in the United States. Really the question was, okay, so what are our buyers thinking? So once we defined our buyer, we go out and just ask them point blank via, a number of different kind of research mechanisms, going out and basically saying, okay, what are your priorities? What products do you use? What do you want from those products? And of those desires, which ones have been delivered on and which ones leave you wanting more? We'll ask about who's involved in the purchase process. And this is, it serves two purposes. It's self-serving in that we want to learn, right? But it's also intelligence that, when aggregated, can be played right back to the marketplace, because people that buy corporate training software, they want to know what their competitors are thinking. They want to know what the industry is thinking and what direction it's moving. And so we're in the process of creating a really interesting thought piece around the state of corporate L&D and how technology weaves in and out of that.
Yeah, no, that's helpful because really understanding the buyer is, I don't know, it's everything, but it helps with almost everything, I imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're truly a customer-centric organization, at some point, every decision comes back to, is this right for our customers?
Yeah, talk about, how did you name the company? Mission Flywheel.
Yeah, so the idea, it's really two parts. The flywheel concept, for those that aren't familiar, it's a mechanical device that you find in, under the hood of your car. You'll find it in, trains, jet engines, what have you. And basically what it does is it captures and distributes momentum. So as you know, if you're stopped at a red light and you have no momentum, it's harder to get moving and get up to 55 miles an hour from zero than it is to get there from 45, right? And that's just basic physics 101. You don't even have to be a physics student to understand that conceptually. But the metaphor for business is, I think, very apropos because, especially in a growth stage business, it's not a steady uphill climb. It's jagged, right? You hit speed bumps. You hit some grooves where you can accelerate, and then you get stuck behind a Sunday driver. I'm going deep with the auto metaphors here, and so as you navigate those twists and turns, right? It also internally, I mean, you could lose a big client, you could lose a valued team member. Like all of that is disruption, and if your goal is to power through it 24/7, you need a flywheel. You need some perpetual motion. And I believe that buried within the revenue organization is the opportunity to set an agenda for the organization. So if you think about the functions that sit under a CRO, you create demand in the marketing department, hand it off to sales where they capture that demand, get the signature, move it on to the customer success organization. That's where they nurture the demand. And that three-part flow is more or less how revenue organizations work traditionally, but there's a fourth piece, which really is revenue operations. It's knocking down the silos, using data to get these different organizations talking to one another, sharing, enabling one another. And so what's really cool is when it's done right, revenue operations actually turns a funnel into a loop. And I think we all need to move away from a funnel-centric ideology and think about a loop powered by data, which is just getting more output from less. Everything, everywhere you look, right? Everyone's doing more with less. Everyone's focused on efficiencies. And so the flywheel is so important for that. And then I thought, well, to what end is that flywheel mantra, achieving something? And I thought, I like working with businesses that are really in touch with their why, right? We are in business. We have a mission. We have vision and values. This isn't just HR speak. For some it is, but a lot of people take that seriously. And those are always my favorite clients, the ones who really understand why they do what they do. So put it together, Mission Flywheel, and domain was available. So I went for it.
That's part of the battle too.
Yeah.
We're talking about causes, and these are some of the things I imagine types of companies you want to work with. Talk about this piece. You often don't see a causes, page on someone's website.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily apply to every single client engagement. Mission driven might just mean I'm a good employer. I take care of my people. I created a psychologically safe environment where they can all be their best. That's perfectly good. But a lot of clients I've worked with, have really made big commitments to solving social problems. I worked with a company called Vitalite. Actually, it was they're a Pan-African company, but I worked with their subsidiary in Malawi, and they had a very interesting challenge, right? So what did they want to do? At the highest level, they're contributing to the growth of renewable energy across the globe, one country at a time. And in this case, what they're trying to do is get residential solar installations in rural areas, because everyone in Africa is focused on the urban areas. Infrastructure is oftentimes, a daunting challenge. Their strategy is to go into rural areas through a network of resellers. So they have about 250 people. And the big question is, are these people, are they following the playbook? Do they even have a playbook, right? Are they representing the brand the right way? Are they cutting side deals, right? There's a lot of question marks. And so I came in and worked with the team to create a performance framework, which basically brought in data, not only from the revenue side, but also from their call center, just to understand how effective they were in working with customer success reps, how like the quality and quantity of interactions that they were creating, and to just create a very objective scorecard of who is out there really hustling on behalf of the company, and then combining that with some training methodology to say, all right, just a refresher, we're going to do this every 3 months. Here's who we are. Here's what we stand for. Here's why we're different. Here's why the customer needs to buy today. And so the whole goal of that project was to hit some sales targets and qualify for a World Bank grant. And we nailed it. Even in spite of the fact that a lot of our project was diluted. It wasn't supposed to be a pun, but it is a pun. It was diluted by the monsoon season. We didn't achieve the impact that we wanted during those months, but we made up for it in the other months, nailed our targets, and now they got fresh funding to keep pursuing their mission. So that's just an example, right? I mean, the cause is climate. We know what that means. There's a million paths to the finish line, and I love working with companies that have an appetite to solve those big problems.
You've had an interesting journey here, and specifically to getting to Google. Talk about that for a second and your journey to Google.
Good question. Very different from my time at Google. I spent about 6 years at Google, and I spent longer than that trying to get in. Early on, in the early days of the internet, right when I was coming out of school, I was kind of an internet geek fanboy, really interested. I remember having an email address when I didn't know anyone to email. So I always knew that that was the place for me because I said, this company's doing amazing things. I'm just going to make it my single-minded focus to get in there. And it took me about 7 years and about 30 interviews. But I eventually, I didn't have the traditional profile for what I was aiming for. But eventually I got there. Lesson learned. Sometimes you just keep hammering away till you get it. And really what it came down to was, using my experience in research, talking sort of coherently about how data informs business decisions, combining that with agency experience, entering the ad sales organization. A lot of that business goes through agencies. And so effectively, I was Google's customer before I was Google's employee. And, a lot of that, helped to sort of propel me in. It also takes a little bit of luck because it was and still is a hard organization to get into. So I'm not going to say I didn't also get a little lucky.
Yeah. Well, there's a formula for luck, right? I forgot what it is. It's hard work plus persistence or something like that. Plus, a little dab of fate or timing in there.
And there's a quote that I think adds an extra bit of icing to what you just said, which is, and I don't know who said it, but the adage goes, chance favors the prepared mind. In other words, luck is luck. There's always going to be some arbitrary nature to whether you flip heads or flip tails. But that there are things you can do to improve your probability. So it's not a coin toss, right? And putting yourself in the firing line of those strokes of good fortune, I think that's not wishful thinking, and that's not, fluff. That's real.
Talk about some of the learnings at Google. Obviously, it was important for you, and you spent a lot of time and energy because you knew it's just an amazing company and you wanted to work there. What were some of the learnings once you got there?
One of them was I was completely unprepared to manage exceptionally high performers. Prior to Google, I had certainly had, the joy of managing great team members. But at Google, there is such a high proportion of individuals who have always been the best at what they did. Took a pay cut or a prestige cut to get a job at Google, right? And there's a level of hustle there. I wrote this in my goodbye note. I said, for all the amazing leaders, for all the incredible clients, products, all of that, it was the peers that really made it what it was. And managing those people, making sure that I wasn't a roadblock to their success, but actually an enabler of their success. really, kept me on my toes. Another thing that I will say, learning how to function in a big company blew my mind. And the more time I spent at Google, the more I realized I didn't know. Having been an entrepreneur and managing partner at a small agency, and prior to that, small companies, right? Um, the way you navigate a monster corporation and the way that trickles down to your relationships, your personal brand, your commitment to learning in the workplace, and sort of the how to play the influence game without getting sucked into politics. Um, those are lessons I'll take with me forever.
Talk about the managing high performers for a second. And what are some of the things that you did? I mean, you mentioned one thing, which is like not being a roadblock for people. Sometimes I maybe find I don't realize that I'm if I'm being a roadblock or not for someone consciously. What were some of the things you did as you learned from a managing high performers standpoint that worked?
Um, Tried a little bit of everything. A lot of things worked, but a lot of those didn't work all the time, right? One thing that I think did work all the time, I took a fantastic week-long course on the art and science of coaching. And, if I boil it down, Jeremy, like I just learned how to ask good questions, when to ask them, why to ask them. And the value of asking good questions so that you help people find solutions from within rather than, versus resisting the temptation to say, hey, I've been around the block. I think I know what the medicine is for this, what ails you. But no, if you're making a long-term investment in someone, you're much better off taking the time to help them get there. And so I think that, it's it's a gift to be able to do that with incredibly independent, resourceful people who start to get it pretty quickly. If you know how to ask good questions, it'll click into place pretty quickly.
Yeah, I love that. Thanks for sharing that. I know one of the things that you think about a lot, I do too, actually, is setting a good example for your kids. I'd love to hear what you learned. It could be at Google, it could be just in business, and how that affects your parenting, what you've learned from the business side.
Yeah. I'll be honest. I actually try to unlearn things more from my work when it comes to parenting.
Like what?
Um, and there are some things that I probably could also model better. I'm very very imperfect when it comes to parenting. But what I would say is, you know, kids have they see things very literally, and they see things through their lens. They haven't yet necessarily honed the skills of, appreciating the value of other perspectives. And so, one of the things that I caught on to right in the middle of the pandemic was their awareness of the amount of time that we spent at work. Right? I mean, what used to be dropping them off at daycare or kindergarten or whatever, saying goodbye, and then coming back and it's already dark and it's time for dinner, became something much more textured because now there's a closed door and a muffled voice behind the door and, different sort of cadence to the day. Um, I've always wanted my kids to understand there's a reason why I go into a sort of a black hole as far as they can tell, right? And right before we hopped on this call, I told you I was like, hold on a second, I got to go tell my kids make sure they're quiet because they're right in the next room. Um, I want them to have a healthy relationship with work. I want them to understand, just the same way math homework might be a little annoying now, or, going to the teacher's office hours doesn't really measure up compared to hanging out in the playground. But I want them to understand that, like, it doesn't have to be a binary outcome. where there's work and there's play. Work can be play, and play sometimes is work, right? And so a healthy appreciation for what lies in the middle in that gray area, I think is maybe not a key to happiness because I won't pretend like I have keys to happiness, but it's something I want to leave them.
What were you thinking, Paul? You're at University of Michigan, right? You're studying communication. What did you at that point think you wanted to do?
Coming out of school,
Yeah,
man, I had no clue, to
no clue.
be honest. And I had a few false starts in my career where a little bit of planning might have done me some good. Um, my senior year of college, I branched out in a big way. I made more friends, in the tail end of school than the other years put together. I was, involved in a lot of stuff. I had a radio show. I had, all kinds of clubs and projects, and I enjoyed it. I went abroad. I had a little brother, like through the local sort of Big Brother program. And I just started to realize like, oh my God, the world is there's so much richness out there. I just want to explore. And yeah, that's cool. Everyone loves to explore, but not the best like mindset to be in when it's time to hunker down for your first step in your career. So what did I want to do? I didn't really know where it would take me, but I always thought it would be a pretty safe bet that if I worked with numbers and I worked with people, some combination of those two would work out okay for me.
Yeah, because you always seemed that you were into tech, so I wasn't sure if you had your heart set on Google from the get-go, but you kind of just that windy pathway took you there eventually.
That's right.
Talk about Google and specifically what you did with the automotive piece.
Yeah, so the whole time I was there, I was working on automotive clients and touched a little bit of everything. So, the manufacturers, the resellers, the after sales, right? Like the Goodyear tires and the AutoZones of the world. I've always been an enthusiast of the automotive business and just a lover of cars since I couldn't even walk. And so it was pretty awesome to sort of blend my passion for technology, my passion for automobiles, and then also to get to do it as my job and get paid for it. It was pretty cool. Um, I would say I reached the apex when I was in charge of vertical strategy for global automotive. So we had $1 billion business. There were about 300 people, just pure ad sales, and then countless internal partners that were working on that business. And there was a great diversity to that business. So you might have like the team in Detroit that's 14 people that only talk to Ford. And then there's the guy in New Zealand who does auto, travel, and finance all together. And all of those were sort of like our team's clients, right? Because they all needed a sort of a strategy to lift all boats. And so really our team's mandate was we're going to raise the floor in the emerging markets. We're going to raise the ceiling in the mature markets. And that $1 billion had to grow 25% while we were there. So it was a lot of relationships, a lot of partnerships at a senior level, working with the different business leaders internally to make sure they had what they needed. Working in some cases in a client-facing capacity, not as much as like my pure sales roles, but more for executive engagements. Try to inspire them a little bit. I gave a presentation to the CMO for Eastern Europe at Porsche once, which afterwards he shook my hand and he said, "I've gotten a lot of great presentations from Google, but yours was my favorite because I walk out of here knowing actually what I can do about all this." Right. So yeah, I mean, we had to lean in and find ways to grow that business very ambitiously. And to the earlier discussion, right? I was also lucky enough to have really smart people that were hungry to join that cause.
Um, Paul, I have one last question for you. First of all, thanks for sharing your stories, your journey in I think it's really instructive on some of the things and how you think about things in companies. My last question is mentors. Who were some of your mentors in your professional life, and maybe a piece of advice that they had given you along the way?
There have been a lot, and I've been the recipient of so much good advice. Um, you know, I would say probably the one that comes to mind the most and has been the most persistent and consistent mentor for me is my father. Um, my father, he pretty much came from nothing. He grew up in post-war Italy, bombed to bits from World War II. And, he set a real example for me because as I grew up and I started to learn his story, he was a one in a million case. His his trajectory was a very standard path, which was going to lead him, I think, in his mind, to a very average life, mediocre even. But he was a good student. He always worked hard. And when somebody marched into his school offering a scholarship to go study in the US for his senior year of high school, he seized that opportunity with everything he had. He ignored the pleas from his family, even extended family, saying, "Why on earth would you go to a faraway place when everything you have is here?" But one example that he set was that you don't look a gift horse in the mouth, right? Those opportunities don't just appear; they're not your birthright. They show up, and if you're ready to go for it, you go for it. And he believed in himself. And his father, my grandfather, really was his hero. He never went against anything that my grandfather told him, but he was motivated and he said, "I got to do this." And one of my favorite moments was decades later and I was too young when this happened, but I learned about it later. They came to visit, and my grandfather told him, he said, "All those years ago, I said you were making a mistake. I said I was going to support you. And now I realize I'm glad I did because I was wrong and you were right." And so I always think about that. Opportunities don't grow on trees, right? Like that's something that, there are precious few of them where you can really seize a moment that can change your life. And I think my dad is living evidence of that.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. There's something about a immigrant mentality of hard work and grit, I think, too.
Yep, absolutely.
Paul, I want to be the first one to thank you. Everyone should check out missionflywheel.com to learn more and check out more episodes of the podcast. And we'll see everyone next time. Paul, thanks so much.
Been a pleasure. Thank you, Jeremy.
What I got, you can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the sailing right now. I'm feeling like 100 grand.